understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is podcast time, and today we are going to focus on energy. Remember I told you we weren't going to do the Irish budget? Well, we're not really, but we're going to do it from the angle of energy because the government unveiled a whole rake of plans, subsidies in effect for Irish users of energy, John. But I think what they're really doing is masking the problem, and the problem is Irish energy prices are the highest in Europe. So we're going to focus on that, what it means for society, what it means for the economy, what it means for business, etc. And John, just on the issue of business, we got a lovely email in from Deirdre Mackin, who people will know runs Lucy's Lounge, which is a lovely little
in Temple Bar,
clothes shop in Temple Bar. Dear Mr. McWilliams and Mr. Davis, I've been listening to your podcast and I really appreciate your insights on the business world. As an owner of a small second-hand clothes shop in Temple Bar called Lucy's Lounge, I wanted to share my experience as a micro business owner, one that's often overlooked. She then explains what's going on in micro businesses. She makes the point, and I think it's a really valuable point, that these small, unique, idiosyncratic micro businesses are not just businesses. They are part of culture. They are part of the city's fabric. People regard them. And she's saying that her barometer for success isn't profit. She says, look, I probably earn about the minimum wage after everything's tallied up, right? But she says that the real value in small community-driven businesses like mine is that they don't fit the standard definition of success because they're part of the fabric of society. She says, will you have more conversations on the importance of micro businesses, not just in terms of revenue, but in terms of the joy, culture, and sense of the place that they provide? Deirdre, we will absolutely do that.
That would be a really good podcast, actually.
Yeah. And listeners, if you do run small micro businesses, by all means, just tap us up on Twitter or on Instagram. Drop in your stories. We'd love to hear from you because I think both John and I in effect, the podcast is a micro business. Everything we kind of do is a micro business. You got to keep your revenue going. You got to try and get your ads in. You got to try and get your Patreons in to keep the whole thing going.
But it's a counterbalance to the multinationals that we have here. And as we always say, it's the kind of backbone of the Irish economy.
It's small business, yeah.
Yeah.
And even micro businesses. And John, we are a counterbalance to the multinational that is RTE.
Yes, we are. Yes, you're right. We are.
Providing a public service for free to the listener. No such thing as a license fee, etc. But I think it's a fair point. It's a fair point. We will hold that. That's a gripe for the pub you and I can have, right? However, Deirdre, by all means, we'd love to have you on the show, and we'd love to talk to more micro business owners because, as John says, micro business is the pumping heart of the economy. And with respect to a podcast like the one on energy, probably one of the biggest costs of a micro business is electricity. Is energy. So it's all related. Let's discuss micro businesses over the course, John, of the next couple of weeks. So thank you very much indeed, Deirdre Mackin. I'll just tell you an interesting thing, John, about Lucy's Lounge, right? Deirdre said that the business is 42 years old, which really dates me because I remember what was there before Lucy's Lounge. What was there before Lucy's Lounge? Do you remember we did a podcast on Berlin? And I told you I had gone on a walking tour of gay Berlin. That's very typical of me, right?
Okay, you sat around Berlin.
Exactly. I went on my gay walking tour of Berlin with a lovely guy from Belfast. And he was talking to me about a character, a philosopher, and a medic called Magnus Hirschfeld. Magnus Hirschfeld was harassed by the Nazis for being gay because, of course, the Nazis were not only anti-Semitic, they were homophobic, etc., etc., etc.
A whole lot, yeah.
They were just against everything, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Against everything that wasn't white and Christian and all that sort of stuff. Now, fascinatingly, the building in which Lucy's Lounge now is used to be the center of the gay community, and it was called the Hirschfeld Center. And the reason I know it is because it served late when we were in college. It was the only bar that served late when we were in college. So I remember going in there on a rake of occasions, not making any connection with Hirschfield, and the connection I only made recently. And now, fascinatingly, Deirdre at Lucy's Lounge completes that particular circuit.
Right.
So I think
How
that's a
come
little
they
bit
could get a late license at that time?
I'm not
Was it
sure
a
they could get a
club, or
late
was it
license. Yeah, I think you had to be a member of the club. And I had one. Now I realize I had loads of gay mates in college, but I only had one that was out, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because people came out much later. You forget it was the 80s. It was a very different.
Yeah, exactly.
And we used to go in there, and it was a kind of a Bronski Beat sort of vibe to it. You might remember that. I was doing my best Jimmy Somerville.
Yeah. Hitting those high notes, Mac.
Hitting all the high notes, Johnny. But speaking of high notes, my book, John.
Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah. What a great segue that was.
I just want to ask if people could do me a favor, which is the following. The book is flying out the shops, which is fantastic. But if you get a chance, could you review it on Amazon? Now, good, bad, indifferent. No, actually, only good reviews, John. That's fair enough. Only good reviews.
Unlike the guy in Cork, just to tell you this, after the Cork gig, which was brilliant, by the way, Cork Opera House, we went down to the pub Sober Lane for a bite to eat and a few beers and stuff. And we were having a bit of crack there. And when we were leaving, Macker spied a guy sitting in the corner reading his book. And so he sashayed over to him and
as I do,
as you do, and said, "So, are you enjoying the book?" And he turns around and he says, "It's all right so far, like."
I know, you're Langorle. Exactly.
What a brilliant understatement.
My tail between my legs as I left Sober Lane, thinking it's all right so far, like. Anyway, just on that, if you could do me a favor, it would be great, because the more the book is reviewed on Amazon, the more it goes up the Amazon charts. Allegedly, I have been told this by the publisher. So that would be great. Anyway, John, let's keep the energy up. Let's keep our energy up. Let's talk about energy. Now, we're going to talk about it in the following way. We're going to link global events to local events. And of course, the global event that is everyone's focused on this week is it is the anniversary of October 7th.
Yeah.
So this is the beginning of a process. Now, people might argue that October 7th wasn't the beginning, and we can certainly all acknowledge that that's not the case, right? That October 7th is not the beginning of an occupation or the beginning of a war. It was the moment when Hamas entered Israel and kicked off this latest cycle of violence. Not the first, not the last, the latest cycle of violence, culminating a year later with what looks to be a likely Israeli attack on Iran, and specifically on Iran's infrastructure, its oil and its gas infrastructure, but particularly its oil infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now, last week we were chatting away to Carol Knackley, who is a real expert on energy. And actually, I think we will have her on her own discussing energy, commodities, oil, gas, etc. at Kilconomics. She doesn't know this yet. I'm just thinking that loud. But I think a session on energy with Carol
would be great.
And have a look, kilconomics.com. We'll probably have that up this week. Actually, all the shows are up this week, but I think that we're going to insert an extra one there with Carol on energy. But she was making the point, look, the energy market has changed so dramatically since the 1970s that, yes, there will be an impact on the price of oil if there is an Israeli attack on Iran, but it won't be as grievous as the case in 74 or, let's say, at the Iranian Revolution in 78, 79. But that being said, having been quiet for all the Gaza war, all the initial barrages in Lebanon, now that the Iranians have struck back at the Israelis and the rhetoric is increasing on both sides, and the Iranians, you might have seen, were actually visited by the Saudis this week in a rapprochement that really doesn't do Israel's calculations any good at all, because Israel's hoping to keep the Iranians and the Saudis apart, but that ain't going to happen now. But what we saw in the last couple of days has been a spike upwards in the price of oil, John, to $78 a barrel from 72. So that's a pretty significant increase. And
still going upwards.
And still going upwards. And the reason is that if Israel targets Iranian oil refineries, There is a very significant chance that Iran retaliates against America's allies in the area, ex-Saudi Arabia. So that would be Kuwait, UAE, which are significant producers, and Qatar, of course, which is a significant producer of gas. So this is the way in which, remember we were saying that in the past, the Europeans and the Americans always got involved in the Middle East because the Middle East was felt at the kitchen table through oil prices.
Yeah.
Now, if that becomes a reality again, what the Iranians are hoping is this will strangle the West and the Americans will lean on the Israelis. And the Israelis will be left, after all their saber rattling, with nothing.
Right.
And that's, of course, what the Iranians want.
But on the flip side, are they too far in to back out now? I've been kind of thinking about this. If America pulls back, it leaves Israel completely exposed. And, and then it's just a pile-in on Israel, for better or for worse.
Let's look at the dynamics, right? The Americans have got this great expression, don't piss down my back and tell me it's raining, which is an expression I like.
What?
So basically, don't tell me bullshit.
Yeah.
It's a great expression. A Southern Baptist expression, John. It's a pretty good one, right?
Never heard that one.
In a way, the Israelis have been pissing down the Americans' back and telling them it's raining. Because what they're saying is, we are under siege, we are isolated, etc. But the rest of the world looks at the region and says, hold on a second, you guys are the aggressors.
Yeah.
So at a certain stage, the Americans have to figure out what's in their best strategic interest. Now, it's very, very clear that Netanyahu wants Trump to win. And it's very, very clear that the way in which he pushes the Americans towards Trump is that even in the next 6 weeks, something happens which pushes up American inflation, which pushes down American growth prospects, which pushes up American gas prices. And the Americans are so sensitive to that.
Yeah.
And then threatens an increase in American interest rates, all of which undermines Kamala Harris and the actual sitting administration of Biden/Harris. So don't underestimate Netanyahu's cynicism here. Why? Because he thinks that Trump will be better for him. Now, Carol said that might not necessarily be the case, but fascinatingly, it's all part of this ridiculous geostrategic jigsaw. And putting the pieces together is incredibly difficult. So the Israelis have a vested interest in causing chaos in the Middle East. And as we said, they've a vested interest in sucking the Americans into the conflict.
Yes.
And the Americans do not want it. And you'll notice behind the scenes that Biden is now talking to Netanyahu on an hourly basis, so they say, and security people say, simply to prevent the Israelis or to stop the Israelis hitting the Iranian facilities in a place called Karg Island. And Karg Island is where it's about 25 miles off the coast of Iran. It's where 90% of Iranian refining goes on. The Iranians add about 1.7 billion barrels of oil every day to the global market. If the Israelis take that out, number one, oil prices spike up because there's less supply.
Sure.
And it's the marginal barrel of oil that counts. So when the market is in equilibrium, it can be put out of equilibrium very quickly by a tiny, tiny change in supply. That's the first thing. Second thing is then, what do the Iranians do? They have to retaliate. How do they retaliate? They can retaliate by hitting Israel with weapons, which they have done with missiles. But where they know that they can really hurt America is in taking out UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, those countries. And of course, those countries provide a significant amount of the oil and gas. So we're in a situation where markets are very, very volatile simply because the Israelis regard the oil industry as the ATM for the axis of resistance, right?
Yeah.
So they have to take that out, because you take out the oil industry, Iran has no revenue. It's got no revenue. It can't give its revenue to its proxies all around the Israeli borders. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, of course, if they do this and the Iranians retaliate and oil prices go up, what we will be into is an energy crisis. Yet another energy crisis.
But were we not saying before that America is currently a net exporter of oil, and they're producing a lot more through fracking, etc. So they're actually okay. Although, having said that, I did read recently that the American oil industry were worried that America are using up their reserves way too quickly.
Oh, I'm sure they are. But America, as you always know, acts first and thinks later, right? That's the real American thing.
Shoot first.
Shoot first. Yeah. Locked and loaded, all that sort of stuff. No, so what I'm just saying is we are going into a period where the price bias in energy is going to be upward.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying, right? And we had thought we were going to go into a period when the price bias was going to go down. But this, of course, that idea has been knocked on the head. And of course, that leads us then, because the price of oil is the foundational price of energy, and because energy is basically the story of the economy. You don't have an economy without energy.
Yeah, of course.
I was writing the other day that, the Industrial Revolution was nothing more than humans figuring out other things to burn, right?
Yeah.
To generate heat, to change the molecular structure of all sorts of stuff, which is basically chemistry. But that's all it was. Yeah. So what you see is that we talked about this before, but that for so long, humans use the energy released by fire to basically dominate the world. And for so long, it was our dependence on fire, but also our adroitness with fire that led to this idea of the pyrophyte species, that we are this animal that has been determined by this technology and this energy, and that energy is fire. And that makes sense. And we've changed ourselves physically, we've changed ourselves socially because of fire, because socially, of course, we hung around, basically chatting around fires.
And fireside chats.
We learned to use our imagination. We learned language, all those sort of social skills that we have, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, the point is that at the core of the human story has always been energy. And of course, as we have become much more energy intensive since the Industrial Revolution, at the core of the human story has been fossil fuels and burning fossil fuels to create the molecular change that was needed for chemistry, industrialization, plastics, all that sort of carry on. So we've always been dependent on energy. And of course, the country that sort of shrugs its shoulders and says, you know what? Let other people figure out the energy dilemma. We'll import the stuff from you guys. You guys do the heavy lifting. We'll just import it. That country ends up paying a lot. And who's that country, John? Ireland.
Yes,
right?
Indeed.
As I call it, it'll be grand approach to energy policy.
Yeah.
And that has led us into the strange situation, John, a lamentable situation where Ireland has the most expensive energy prices in Europe. As of late 2023, so this time last year, before this carry on in the Middle East, right, we paid about 44 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity. That is double the EU average of 22 cents, right? Now, that is an extraordinary, this equates to an average electricity bill of 1,374 euros per household in this country, which is double almost the average in the EU.
Yeah.
Now, this, of course, is a total and utter disaster for us, not least because energy is the alchemy of economics. It's what drives the economy. It's what drives everything in the economy, right? And of course, why is this? Because Ireland has decided that we are going to become the most import-dependent country in Europe. 80% of our energy needs, right? 80% are imported. Now, in contrast...
But as an island nation, certainly back in the 70s and 80s, we didn't really have much choice. I mean, we had a couple of hydroelectric stations and stuff, but we didn't have a significant amount of gas or oil that we could tap into. So we were kind of hamstrung.
No, I think you're right. And we're basically at the end of a pipe as well. Right?
Yeah.
The gas pipe. We are at the end of the European gas pipe, and we're not connected, of course, to the continental grid, and the continental grid, because it's much more efficient, reduces the price. However, we have ended up with the highest energy prices in Europe. Now, take a country like Denmark.
Yeah.
Denmark is the leader in renewable energies. Denmark is a bit like Ireland. It's cold and damp and doesn't have any fossil fuels. 50% of its electricity comes from its wind farms, and it only imports 45% of its energy. In contrast, Ireland imports 80%. So what gives is that Ireland, unlike Denmark, the Danes have said, okay, we are going to figure out what we have to do to become less energy dependent than we need to be, despite the fact that, like Ireland, they don't have natural resources, they don't have fossil fuels, they don't have coal, they didn't have oil, all that sort of stuff. They've said, okay, but we've got wind. We're out here on the North Sea, we've loads and loads of wind. Now, there's one thing we know that Ireland has, which is loads and loads of wind. And we've loads and loads of wave. These are two renewable sources. So the Danes have gone from having total dependency on imported oil and gas to a much more significantly less dependency. We have, despite all the talk, and having a Green Party that's been in government 2 times over the last 15 years.
Yeah.
And we know we have climate change targets. We know part of this is renewables. We know we have to do it. And here we are, John, with the highest energy prices in Europe.
Yeah, but Mac, we have great cycle lanes.
We have no cycle lanes.
No, we're plowing all our money into cycle lanes. Sorry, I'm being smart, but you're right.
But that's a good thing.
It is a good thing, but for me, it always feels like it's tinkering around the edges of the core problem, which, as we've said before, housing aside, but is the infrastructure and energy generation and transmission.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting. Low energy prices is something that both the left and the right agree on.
Yeah.
So if you're on the left and you're socially engaged, what you know is that you know the way your granny used to say, there's great drying in that weather, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Now that was a really,
I found
really
myself saying that recently, actually.
I know. It's called middle age, John. You're sitting at the back looking at the line, aren't you?
Get that clothes horse out there.
Get that clothes horse out there. But think about what we're saying is, right? Now, in a damp country like Ireland that doesn't have great drying days, usually, the Brits go on about what they call fuel poverty, that a significant amount of the British population lives under the fuel poverty line, meaning that during the winter, they go cold. And of course, when you go cold and damp during the winter, you get sick. And you get sick, the medical bills of the society increase. So it's all of a piece. So if you're on the left, you want lower energy prices, full stop. If you're on, let's say, the commercial right, and you're, let's say, a business owner, or you're thinking about multinationals, and we can go down this road, we talk about them in a minute, you want lower prices. Why? Because energy is a cost to business.
Yeah.
So it's one of the few things that actually the left and the right completely agree on, that high energy costs are socially unequitable and financially hazardous for both business and society. And yet, in our budget this week, I'm sure, John, I know it's something that was very top of your mind. You found the budget the most fascinating document. John looked at me with a big, long face last week and says, are we going to do this budget? And I said, don't worry, John. We don't have to. It's been done better by lots and lots and lots of people, okay?
Yeah,
who got into the weeds on it. But one thing that did strike me was a plethora of government budget. They always say one-off. You know, they always say one-off, right?
Yeah.
One-off subsidies for energy. So there's a whole lot of grants, subsidies, help. There's a one-off 170 million euro energy subsidy scheme, which is going to provide about $4,000 in support for 39,000 hospitality and retail businesses, right? So bars and restaurants, and all that sort of stuff, right? Households are going to get 250 euros worth of electricity credits next year to bring down that electricity bill, et cetera, et cetera. But, John, this is, again, typical of Ireland. We are addressing the symptoms, not the causes, right?
Yes, exactly.
So the cause of the high energy price is the fact that our grid is overcapacity. It is the fact that we don't invest in renewables in any material way, unlike the Danes, for example. We're getting there, but we're getting there too slowly.
Yeah.
We have a country that the population is expanding dramatically. And of course, that puts enormous pressure on all the underlying infrastructure. And in effect, John, Ireland has what could be called a hardware problem, not a software problem. So the software is the brains and the people and all that sort of stuff. The hardware is the nuts and bolts, the stuff the government has to provide, which, as you know, John, is infrastructure, water, electricity, housing, transport, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So we're back again, John, to state inefficiency.
Okay, Mac, let's get into the weeds of this, as you say, a little bit more after a bit of this. So we're talking about energy, and you were talking about particularly the cost for households. And in Ireland, we have the highest energy costs in Europe. But I was also reading Gillian Tett's article in the FT during the week, and she was talking about, obviously, with data centers and Ireland being a hotbed of data centers. If
A
there's
hotbed.
such a thing.
No, you meant to have a hotbed of terrorism, John. It's supposed to be a hotbed of data centers.
But these data centers are pushing up the demand for electricity and energy exponentially. And on one hand, the data centers are great. They're attracting more inward investment and creating more jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a good thing. But on the other hand, and here's my question, what is the priority? I mean, I think I kind of know the answer to that, but maybe a better question is, how do you prioritize energy subsidies to households on one hand or business on the other, working families or the economy?
I think before we answer that, the problem with the subsidies, John, is they're basically making legitimate an inefficiency. The inefficiency is our inability or our unwillingness to get serious about energy in the same way as, for example, Denmark has got serious, right?
Yeah.
And once the Danes get serious, the real promise of renewable energy is that the cost of energy falls to zero. This is the really interesting thing. So once you've put in the capital investment and you get everything going, the promise is you have an economy that is climatically efficient.
Yeah.
So you're not a polluter. B, but probably even more importantly for Ireland, because Ireland is so small that our carbon emissions make such a tiny, tiny impact on global warming, right? But be that as it may, we are part of...
We still do, though. Yeah.
But yeah, and we're part of also the global community that believes, and we sign up for these treaties, and we should obviously ensure that in the next 10 years, we're much more climatically friendly.
Well, we have a target of...
We have a target.
An EU target of 42.5% by 2030. And we have to hit that. And you won't get that by cycle lanes.
Oh, listen to him. Yours, angry. John also has a wine target of Tuesday nights. You don't hit that very often. So, Mr. I'm angry about cycle lanes. Yeah. Okay, I love this too, right? But the key thing is the promise of renewable energy is that part of your overall electricity bill that comes from renewables, the cost can gradually go to zero, which is a phenomenal...
Sure, yeah,
it's a phenomenal aim, right? Because that would revolutionize the relationship between humans and energy. This is when we started this whole thing, that humans have always required energy. Can you imagine getting energy from nature, which costs nothing in the very long run? That, of course, is the big aim. That's the big promise, right? Now, of course, Ireland has done their usual thing, was it'll be grand. It's the St. Augustine approach to make me virtuous, but just not yet. Mañana, mañana, mañana.
Yeah.
And the problem with mañana is it makes you completely vulnerable to global events. And that's why the Danes are much less vulnerable to the Middle East than we are, for example, something over which we have no control. So that would be irresponsible in the extreme if you were to actually if you were even to give a child that proposition. You are about to do something over which other people have the absolute ability to determine and change your life. What do you do? And we're saying, you know what, we're going to do nothing.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. The Gillian Tett article, which I think was very, very interesting, was basically, as you said, posing the question. She makes the point that this week marks the 20th anniversary of Amazon in Ireland. Big, big deal, because Amazon has been a big player here, revenue-wise, employment-wise, etc. She also makes the point that Amazon is about to invest, Amazon Web Services, $30 billion in infrastructure.
Yeah.
And for the first time, Ireland's going to get a big fat zero of multinational investment in Europe. Why? Because Amazon's top brass are worried about our ability to actually power the country. That is a massive wake-up call for us, right? And it percolates down to households.
Or should be.
Should be, right? It should be a massive wake-up. So what they're basically saying is Ireland, the country with the wettest, windiest country in Europe, has a wind, right? Which is has a wind and wave problem, right? even though we're abundant in winds and waves, right? And of course, she's making the point that tech now, that when we talk about tech, we all talk about the cloud and AI and yada, yada, yada. But she's saying, hold on a second, all these softwares are dependent on hardware that is cables, that is data centers, that is power lines, that is electricity grid, these kind of really nuts and bolts things. And if you don't have the nuts and bolts things in place, you don't get all the software goodies that comes with them. Yeah. And the likes of Amazon are saying, hold on a second, Ireland, you guys have been great for the last 20 years, but we cannot see you being the same country in the next 20 years because you don't have the energy.
Yeah. We're losing their confidence big time.
And you haven't, yes, and that's the point. You haven't indicated to us that you are serious about this, right? And that is the key thing. And of course, AI uses 10 times more energy.
Yeah.
Data centers, a massive, massive business for Ireland, gobble up 21% of all Irish electricity.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's a little big figure, right?
Yeah.
And energy is such a big deal for these big multinationals that, for example, Microsoft has just done a deal with 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island is the nuclear power station that exploded in the late 70s, right?
The China Syndrome. Do you remember that movie? And that actually came out just a few weeks before 3 Mile Island accident.
The China Syndrome, exactly.
Yeah,
and it also gave nuclear the really bad name.
Yes, it did.
Even though I don't think many people died 3 Mile Island from nuclear
I don't think
fallout.
so, no.
I don't think so. But it doesn't matter. It gave nuclear a really bad name. Fascinatingly, 40 years later, Microsoft is back in there in production of nuclear energy. And of course, anybody who's regular listening to this podcast will know that I've always believed that nuclear is part of the solution. And I believe that for a long, long time.
Yeah,
but
I agree.
Ireland has a nuclear problem. Anybody over the age of 60 will know that the first great festival in Ireland was Carnsore Point against the nuclear reactor, which was proposed by the Fianna Fáil government in 1977. Even we were too young for that, John, to go to that gig.
I know, but Christy Moore was there.
Christy Moore was there, and he's still here, right? But think about it. So what you have, and this is to answer your question, why is Ireland's infrastructure so creaking? A, because of population increase. B, this is on the demand side, the data centers. C, we're getting richer, and as you get richer, you use more energy anyway.
Yeah.
But that's on the demand side. On the supply side, you have massive problems with the rollout of any sort of expansion of the electricity grid and wind farms. A lot of it to do with our friend, Mr. NIMBY.
Well, I was just going to say that because I think I was telling you before when I spoke on the podcast before, when I was in Spain the year before last, and I did a kind of a thing on wind energy. And when you're driving around, particularly southern Spain, they've wind farms and windmills all over the place, even in the likes of national parks. There's a beautiful area near Tarifa in southern Spain.
A very windy part of the world. It's full of windsurfers, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely. But they had this whole wind farm on the tops of all the ridges in the national park. And it didn't take away from wildlife or the vista. Yeah, it changed the vista. But when you hear the argument about, it ruining the environment, well, there's a trade-off between having windmills and clean energy compared to fossil fuels and all that goes with that. So NIMBYism is a huge thing.
And it's amazing when you talk about Spain, John. It's amazing because Spain is beginning to emerge in a lot of our conversations as the leader in infrastructure, the leader in solar power. Obviously, it's the leader in solar power. I'd say, I believe in the world, Spain is, okay, which makes complete sense.
Yeah.
Metro, train lines, everything. As you're saying, wind farms, they are taking the energy issue seriously.
Yeah.
And we are not. Now, that means that at some stage, we might have to make that choice. That question you posed was, what does the state do if the capacity of the electricity grid is maxed out and the price of electricity keeps going up? Where will they put the subsidies? Will they favor business, multinationals, even small micro businesses that we started, or will they favor families? And of course, the thing about business is businesses don't vote, people do. So what you will find is that politicians will naturally side with the people. So rather than fix the problem, which is get the energy grid up and running as quickly as possible, we will probably, in the Irish case, do what we always did, which is go for the political quick fix, which is let's side with the people. Now this is the interesting. Siding with the people means giving a subsidy. But giving a subsidy is all dependent on what? The corporate tax revenue from the multinationals.
Yeah.
Right? So imagine we didn't have that, right? We couldn't be throwing around all these grants and subsidies, right? But, and this is the paradox, unless we fix the energy problem here, we will face diminishing corporate tax, which will give whatever government comes in the future less money to throw around families to subsidize the creaking infrastructure that they should be rebuilding. And that's the problem. And I think before we go, Ireland played the tax game the last 20 years and it proved transformative. That trick is over, right? We can't engineer lower taxes because we're signed up to the OECD's 15%. Energy will be the taxation of the future. And the country with the lowest energy costs will gain a competitive advantage over everybody else, and investment will flock to the country with the lowest energy costs. At the moment, Ireland has the highest energy cost, and ultimately, energy cost is part of your economic arsenal. And if you're not prepared to actually accelerate the grid infrastructure, face down NIMBYism, put in place massive incentives for people and businesses to invest in renewables, we will end up going from the best boy in the class to the dunce in the next 2 decades. That is the bottom line. And that is why the energy conundrum is the economic conundrum of our times.